blanket the Australian state of New South Wales, transforming day into night.
And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels,
The federal
upon
government
the
is
levers.
cracking down on eco-terrorism and being followed closely by the states.
For the second time in weeks, a young immigrant child has died while in custody at the U.S.
Here to
border.
help protect our water for our future generation. We come here to die. We have to.
Hey friends, I'm Arnold Schroeder and this is Fight Like an Animal. And I am coming at you through the diaphanous haze of post-surgery narcotic pain medication. And therefore, I'm coming at you from the very novel, disorienting, not particularly pleasant perspective of watching social conflict erupt in the streets of every major American city, and things that feel really unprecedented happen in those conflicts, and be confined to watching it all on the internet. And it is difficult. It is weird not in a good way. But here I am, and this is a situation to which I am subject and have no control over, and so I hope that I can contribute in some small way by offering whatever extent of theoretical insight I possess from participating in these kinds of struggles in the past, to the extent that this kind of struggle has ever really happened in the past, and from all the books and scientific papers that I'm constantly reading. Anthropologists describe in-group, out-group dynamics as a cross-cultural universal, as something that is encountered in every culture yet described. And so, these are like very fundamental perceptual categories that seem to ultimately, in their ultimate psychological operation, to be incredibly simple. People classify themselves as belonging to or not belonging to a group. They regard everybody who is outside of the group to which they belong as more different from themselves than they actually are, as entitled to different forms of treatment, different status, to be subject to, for instance, a differential distribution of wealth, etc., etc. But usually in-group, out-group dynamics are highly elaborated. Usually there's some trait that people are said to possess or not possess that signifies they are part of the in-group or not. So for instance, obviously race is a very prominent form of in-group, out-group dynamics that we see play out in societies all around the world. But what I think is so interesting is that every time that social movement conflict escalates, as it has in such a profound way since the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis Police Department about 2 weeks ago, there is a version of in-group, out-group language that gets used that has almost no elaboration whatsoever. People who are engaging in escalated conflict are simply called outsiders or outside agitators. So for instance, the mayor of Minneapolis, after the first few days of fire and street combat in his city, said the protesters, quote, are coming in largely from outside of the city, from outside of the region, to prey on everything we have built over the last several decades. Likewise, the St. Paul mayor said every person who was arrested in the city on one of the nights of particularly intense conflict was from out of state. We don't know these folks, he said. He later walked back this statement because it just wasn't true, and reporters could do a really simple process of verification of looking at the arrest data. Likewise, Trump's Attorney General, Bill Barr, put the blame on unspecified, quote, foreign actors playing all sides to exacerbate the violence. So in this case, they're not just from outside of Minneapolis or St. Paul or Minnesota, they're from outside of the country. And then likewise on May 31st, Bill Barr in a press statement said, quote, "Groups of outside radicals and agitators are exploiting the situation to pursue their own separate, violent, and extremist agenda." So, like I said, this is in-group, out-group language in a totally elemental, primordial, unelaborated form. And whatever the logical implications of this, or the moral implications of all this are supposed to be, is like pretty unclear and never explicitly articulated. I mean, you know, if people are coming to Minneapolis from, I don't know, where are they coming from? From Denver? From Chicago? From Wisconsin? Is their rage really all that, you know, any less valid? And then likewise, as conflict has erupted in literally every major city in the United States, one has to imagine that outside agitation is now just sort of a function of tragically underdeveloped logistics, right? Where we must at this point have outside agitators crossing one another in the night. We must have outside agitators from Oakland traveling to Los Angeles, while outside agitators from Los Angeles simultaneously travel to Oakland. But of course, the actual explicit logical and moral implications of these constructs of the outside agitator aren't really all that important. What's important is that it plays on a fundamental human psychology that perceives itself as belonging to an in-group and perceives everybody in the out-group as dangerous and warranting different treatment. So I was going to make episode 4 of this podcast an interview that I did with my friend Ken Ward about ecological politics, about why ecological politics are not right-left politics, about the innate contributors to an ecological worldview, the psychology of perceiving the world in ecological terms, and kind of what ultimately happened to the environmental movement, why in so many respects it essentially doesn't exist anymore. But then episode 5 was going to be a discussion about violence and nonviolence. And I was going to frame it a little more elaborately than that, but that's ultimately a lot of what I was going to be talking about. And it just felt like the logical progression of the material that I wanted to cover, but it didn't feel particularly pertinent to anything that was actually happening at the very moment. And now it sure does. So I've reversed that order, and the interview I recorded with my friend Ken will be episode 5. But this time around, I am going to wade into the truly perennial mire of violence and nonviolence discussions. And you know what I would say about this time, this moment of social rupture, is that it is certainly true that the outside agitator trope has been around for a long time and is a perennial fixture in moments of heightened social conflict, but that there really is some way in which how it's playing out now is so indicative of the just like unhinged conspiratorial tribal thinking of our time in our politics at large. Unlike in the past, when it used to be that basically liberals were convinced there were 2 kinds of nefarious elements breaking windows and fighting the police. There were outside agitators, nefarious anarchists. It didn't matter exactly what they were outside of or where they were from. They just weren't from the city where they were breaking windows and fighting the police. And then they were also, of course, convinced that people engaging in escalated conflict were agent provocateurs, agents of the police. And then conservatives tended to believe only one of these things. They tended to believe, they shared the perspective with liberals that people fighting the police were outside agitators, nefarious anarchists. But now we see a whole new level of bizarre absurdity applied to this theme. So, you know, probably most famously, We have Donald Trump claiming that a man named Martin Gugino from Buffalo, New York, who was pushed down by police and seen in a video bleeding from his head as a result and is now in the hospital, staged the incident as an undercover agent provocateur of Antifa, which he apparently perceives as a clandestine and highly organized network rather than a broad sort of political identity. And, then you also have, it's pretty impossible to actually summarize. You have people claiming that the property destruction and conflict with the police is the work of drug cartels. Obviously the liberals, because everything is a function of a Russian plot, have seen Russia in the work of multiracial, multi-generational crowds of people jubilantly destroying police stations in the cities that they're from. And then there's also there's a spin on it where it's like, and this has some relationship to reality. There's a spin on it where like literally all of the conflict is the work of white supremacists or far-right militia people who are just looking for a sort of great conflagration to consume the United States and to get to break out their AR-15s in their body armor and fight the United States government. And some of those people have shown up to protests and are on the internet cheering on the chaos because they perceive the chaos as an opportunity for their politics to flourish. But this has become a means of like literally conflating all acts of conflict, of just ignoring the actual images that you see of these incredibly large, racially diverse, multi-generational crowds engaging in acts of destruction together, or engaging in other forms of protest, but clearly having no problem with the people who are choosing to fight in the ways that they're choosing to fight. And it's a way of negating all of the reality of all of those different people and negating all those unique identities that are contributing to this political moment and being like, oh, they're all white supremacists. All those black people are white supremacist, far-right militia types. And so, there is a level of totally crazy, like, just like I said, like bizarre tribal conspiratorial thinking in the response to these protests that is kind of new and does just sort of characterize this particular age that we're living in, where it seems like cognitive biases are being increasingly amplified and people are engaging in increasingly mutually incomprehensible forms of reasoning, and that the conclusions that they're coming to about the world, the stories that they are constructing about the world, increasingly just overtly reflect psychological need and ideology more than they do any kind of shared process of reasoning that coexists among themselves and other people who have different ideologies or different sort of like cultural inclinations or whatever. So, much as we live in an age where Russia is responsible for everything and the COVID pandemic is a conspiracy, and, just like the endless litany of bizarre mythologies that have emerged in our culture that have that have nothing to recommend them in terms of the actual reasoning processes or the justifications or the evidence that gets cited in their favor, but are purely functions of accommodating psychological, need and emotional need and cognitive bias. These mythologies are getting more intense. Cognitive bias is definitely getting amplified in our society, and we are hyper-differentiating into an increasingly chaotic landscape of mutual incomprehension. And so you can really see that in the response to these protests. And I think that that's kind of ultimately always what we're talking about in this podcast, is that the surface justifications that people invoke for any given worldview, for any given ideological position, for any given strategic position, are always cited as the reason they maintain the position. But that ultimately there's some underlying dynamic of emotional or psychological need that their political position or their strategic outlook or their conspiracy about COVID-19 or whatever, there's some need or bias that this accommodates. And so we're always going to be assuming that the surface rationale, the actual like explicit discourse around a given subject is kind of immaterial, and that we should be looking for the underlying psychology. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be trying to do today. I'm going to wade into this discussion from this perspective, asking not what new can we say about violence and nonviolence that hasn't been said before, but what can we say about the underlying psychological, experiential motivations for favoring violence or nonviolence. But then I also want to, applying the lens of innateness, applying the biology of the human species, approaching social movement struggle from that perspective, as we always will do in this podcast. I want to see if we can't transcend this useless, tedious, endless, agonizing, goddamn binary that we've spent the last however many decades yelling at each other about.
He pleaded for his life. He said he couldn't breathe.
Over the past 40 years, government funding for the police has tripled to more than $100 billion.
And through that work, his estimates show that in a period where there were those nearly 23,000 excessive force complaints, police shot and killed roughly 10,000 people.
Nonviolent.
Seen here firing pepper balls at a woman and striking her with a baton.
I analyzed the data, and the results blew me away. From 1900 to 2006, nonviolent campaigns worldwide were twice as likely to succeed outright as violent insurgencies.
A lot of people are saying that this moment feels qualitatively different to them than other moments of social struggle in the past. And confined to watching it all play out on the internet, I have to also say it sure looks a lot different than anything that I've ever observed or participated in. And so, the truly mass character of this is pretty unprecedented. There's simply more people confronting the police in more places. The fact that people are taking and burning police stations is really different. I think on some level, what's happening right now illustrates a point that I thought Standing Rock illustrated really powerfully, which was just that there are not enough police in this nation to suppress mass dissent if it happens at a great enough scale in a sufficient number of places. And that was illustrated by the fact that at Standing Rock, in the social movement nomenclature, there's acts of dispersion and acts of concentration. Standing Rock was certainly a massive act of concentration. People came from all over to fight pipeline construction in ultimately a very small area, a circle with a radius of maybe 20 miles. But then likewise, police came from all over. I can recall a discussion that was overheard by a friend relatively early on in August of 2016, when one cop said to another, "I don't think there's enough police in Morton County to deal with this." And the reply was, "Oh, there aren't enough police in North Dakota to deal with this." And there weren't. Police ultimately had to come from many other states and many other jurisdictions. And it really illustrated, because that left a huge amount of the United States of America significantly lacking in police resources. It really illustrated that, I think we could have won at Standing Rock if we had been able to take that act of concentration and then disperse it out at a certain point. If we could have taken the tactical momentum and the energy and the willingness to embrace risk and conflict that we generated there and spread out our actions over a sufficient geographic area, I just don't think they would have had the resources to deal with it. And we are seeing exactly that happen right now. There just are not enough police to suppress this rebellion. So that feels really new. I cannot think of a time that it seemed so clear that there was a conflict occurring in the United States of America of sufficient intensity and scale that there just really weren't police resources to deal with it. And then in psychological terms, and again, I have to invoke this perspective of an outsider, but I have seen people explicitly saying this. A thing that seems really, really different is that people just do not seem afraid. They don't seem afraid of the police. They don't seem particularly afraid of death. They seem a lot more angry than they are afraid of the consequences of fighting. And that's really new. And then what I would say is qualitatively different about this moment of social rupture in more explicitly political terms, what that means in political terms is that people aren't listening to liberals anymore. And so I think that this is as good a time as any to kind of add to our map of the political landscape that we began tentatively staking out in episodes 1 through 3 in the biology of the right-left divide, where we described the right-left political spectrum in all its many innate corollaries, how everything from brain structure to physiology to baseline psychological orientations about risk and stimulation and novelty versus, for instance, security and achievement, all map to right-left politics, and how the right-left political continuum can be found in pretty much every society that has crossed certain thresholds of social and technological complexity. So I think that you can divide the right-left political spectrum in half and say that everybody on one side of it is on the right and everybody on one side of it is on the left. Or, obviously not literally everybody is anywhere on the political spectrum. I'm not on that political spectrum. But I think that we should probably add to the complexity now and describe liberals as a truly unique tribe, as their own political tribe. So we can now broadly envision three political entities as having a statistically significant presence in American politics and in the politics of every society that is intensively technological and has developed sufficient levels of social complexity. So liberals on some level are kind of like moderate leftists. But the point that I want to emphasize is that they truly have no counterpart on the right. The right is a far more cohesive entity. Certainly there are people who are further right than other people, and certainly there are people who are advocating for more aggressive forms of right-wing politics. But this is one sense in which the theory that I articulated in the biology of the right-left divide would appear to be pretty powerfully validated, is that the entire landscape of right-wing politics, my theory was ultimately that the biology of aggression, which has all these idiosyncratic traits correlated with it, which seem to be the same traits that are described by political psychologists as corollaries of difference in political outlook, there seems to be a far more aggressive form of politics in general that's being engaged in by the right. And I talked a lot about how this is true in terms of the actual capacity for physical force, right? Like the police are a fundamentally right-wing entity. And acknowledging that goes a long way to transcending the incessant shock and surprise that's registered in the mainstream media and even in the left media every time the police do something that's overtly right-wing. The radical disparity in how they're treating people who are angry over the murder of George Floyd and everybody else that the police murder, as opposed to the way that they treated people who stormed Capitol buildings with assault rifles because they wanted to be able to go to Quiznos and get haircuts. Every time that the police overtly side with a white militia, for instance, as they did in Philadelphia recently, where armed men from the KKK, I believe, were wandering the streets with baseball bats looking for protesters to beat up and just totally got a pass from the police. I mean, this litany goes on and on. All the police who are in Facebook groups and whatnot that are like extreme right-wing, hyper-racist entities. So like the capacity for force itself, for aggression itself, appears to have a pretty like strong ideological bias. But then even when you get into the landscape of politics per se, and even institutional politics, we see this massive disparity in aggressiveness, where the right is sort of unified in a sort of fundamentalism, in operating from a place of core conviction, and from always being willing to shift. There's the concept of the Overton window, right? There's what's considered an acceptable range of political discourse, and then you can shift that range by saying something far outside of what's perceived as the acceptable range, of normalizing your ostensibly radical perspective. And the right is very willing to do that in a way that is much, much less clear on the left. Like right-wing senators and, like prominent public figures. I mean, the President of the United States of America, for instance, are totally willing to embrace perspectives and people who are far outside of the Overton window, who are extreme right-wingers, basically. And you can also see this in kind of like the nonprofit think tank landscape, where to do some environmental work or some like kind of left like justice work of some kind, there are extremely narrow parameters on what can actually get funded. And this is emphatically not the case on the right. If I was a similar entity in terms of like the level of research that I did, the level, like the just like sheer like work days that I'm willing to put in, and the level of organizing capacity that I demonstrated, but I was on the right, I would have been able to find massive troves of funding that have just mostly evaded me. I mean, I've lived month to month on little like stipends and grants and donations from supporters and stuff like that while I was really organizing in earnest. But I've just never had any kind of really significant institutional funding. And if I was the same kind of person but a crazy right-winger, I absolutely would. So there's just like really this level in which I think another way that we could talk about this is George Lakoff's great book, Don't Think of an Elephant, which just talks about the ways in which in mainstream political discourse, the right is far more willing to reference their kind of core moral convictions, their basic premises from which they're operating. Whereas liberals tend to, which is like the only representation that the left ostensibly has in mainstream politics, tend far more to actually really kind of obscure their core moral priorities, if indeed they possess any, and to invoke instead appeals to some sort of hypothetical shared framework of like rational discourse, and to always kind of be willing to compromise on their principles to indulge the perspectives of their political adversaries and try to essentially illustrate how they aren't hostile to how their political positions aren't hostile to right-wing perspectives in some sense. Like a classic move from like a liberal environmental group is not to say the world is dying, so we should abandon the civilization that's killing the world, but to say these light bulbs only cost 67 more cents than the light bulbs that consume more energy. And we've done a survey, and 75% of Americans say that they would be willing to spend 67 more cents on these kind of light bulbs. Like this stuff that just doesn't actually refer to any basic moral premise. So there's all these ways in which the right and the left are highly differentiated, and like the right has representation in institutional politics, but the left really doesn't. We have this tribe of people who say that they care about some of the same things and that they kind of ultimately have the same objectives, the liberals, but they really they create this very hard barrier between themselves and the left proper. And they don't fight in the same way that the right fights for these moral premises that they claim to share with us. And so, like one really powerful illustration of this is when these moments of social rupture occur that escalate to the point of a window breaking or a cop getting a tear gas canister thrown back at it. Because these in-group, out-group dynamics that I've described as always emerging have a very specific character. The liberals always are there to say, we understand why people are upset. We are upset about the same things people are upset about. We share their convictions and we share their political objectives. But breaking windows and throwing tear gas canisters back at police is not how we protest. We protest by making our point and letting the police hurt us as much as they want without fighting back, because we are engaged in a moral dialogue. And the one thing that threatens that moral dialogue is if we fight back. But if we don't, then we will come to some kind of consensus. As a species, we are moving through history towards some sort of inevitable consensus, right? This has been the default position since the fucking Enlightenment, is that humanity is eminently rational and all social conflict is sort of this vast dialogue that we have to navigate to ultimately converge on some shared set of perceptual coordinates, and at that point we'll achieve social harmony, and everything that everybody's upset about will no longer be occurring, and the police and the evil corporations and the government will all see the point that the protesters are making, and accommodations will be made. And so what I want to note about that in-group, out-group language is that the in-group in this case that liberals are implicitly articulating, the we in this case, is both the protesters and the police and the power structure. It's both the people who are committing the harm and the people who are opposing the harm. And then the outsiders are simply this small group of people who think that there comes a point when you should stop letting people hurt you without fighting back. And so that I think is one of the really powerful ways in which violence-nonviolence language tends to sow profound discord in social movements and to just tear apart whatever social cohesion exists in movements, is that it creates an in-group that is pretty insidious, and it creates an out-group that doesn't really make any sense.
In Beverly Hills, a 1 p.m. curfew went into effect today, all part of an effort to prevent some of the looting and violence that happened in locations around Los Angeles.
Demonstrators have started to come up and down this thoroughfare of Marietta and break out windows of CNN.
Disturbing footage shows a man using an aerosol can to torch a San Bernardino DMV.
Video out of Chicago shows an officer chasing and punching a protester.
Police officer not guilty of
Nonviolent
or manslaughter.
Officer Betty Shelby
Nonviolent.
has been found not guilty by a jury trial in first-degree manslaughter in the shooting death of Tanner.
Officer Gerardo Llanes is not guilty of manslaughter in the shooting death of Philando Castillo.
We, the jury, find Dominic Keegan Brown not guilty.
So then, of course, the question becomes, what makes a liberal? If we're operating from this premise that the surface political arguments people present kind of don't actually matter that much and are ultimately just rationalizations of unarticulated core dispositions, then what creates this creature we call the liberal, which has no real counterpart on the right? I think that there's maybe 4 contributors, and I think that these are sort of like the core contributors to, I think that these 4 things have more to do with creating political difference than anything else. So the first, of course, is just the innate right-left spectrum of political orientation that we've already talked about. I would say that liberals fall onto something like the left half, or somewhere in the middle with a leftward skew of the political continuum. But they ultimately just do have innate psychological templates that orient them towards more hierarchical political worldviews with a greater resistance to change. But then I think that the other thing, and then this is where we can actually start to ask about how innate orientations interact with environmental conditions to produce the world that we actually see, rather than insisting in the mode of the nature versus nurture binary that we only look at one or the other. I think that liberals are also tend to be people who are materially fairly secure. And so, like, one of the reasons that I presented the research on the right-left political spectrum before I talked about anything else in this podcast was because people have done more research about it. So I could cite all of this different research that indicated that there was this pretty, like, extensive landscape of psychological tendencies and physiological differences and whatnot that correlate with political outlook. And therefore I could kind of use it as a model to talk about more nuanced forms of political difference, even if they haven't been as researched. So in some sense, I have to content myself with saying a lot of the research about the left-right spectrum, really, like, that research really only kind of like blew up and started really producing all these convergent findings in the last 10 years or so. So on some level, I have to content myself with saying I think we can imagine a study that would produce X or Y result. And I think that in the case of political liberalism, we have people who are innately more hierarchical and resistant to change than people who are on the left proper. But I also think that if you did a survey looking for liberal political values per se, if, for instance, you asked people about their perceptions of trashing police stations, who were all kind of on the left half of the political spectrum, and then you made a graph relating that information to income, I think you would find a linear relationship. I think you'd find a linear negative relationship between income and support for fighting back against the police. So that certainly is an aspect of liberalism. It's simply the politics of people with something to lose. Revolutions are risky, right? And people with something to lose don't tend to favor revolution and legitimately revolutionary strategies as much as people who don't really have a whole fucking lot left to lose. Then I think that another contributor is identity. I mean, I think that the categories of identity that social movement participants tend to somewhat exclusively in a lot of cases focus on really do matter. If somebody comes from a racial group that tends to be persecuted by society at large, that's radicalizing. If somebody has a sexual orientation that they risk violence for or is considered invalid by the people they grew up around or whatever, that's somewhat radicalizing. I think on its own, it doesn't explain much. Like the mayor of Seattle is gay, and she very much used her identity as kind of a substitute for a platform. Like I totally recall her campaign propaganda when she was elected was all like gay pride rainbows or whatever. And she had been involved. She had been a district attorney who was involved in prosecuting anarchists in like grand jury witch hunts against anarchists for breaking windows and stuff like that. And and she's out there ordering the police to suppress political dissent with riot gear and rubber bullets and tear gas. But I do, so, you know, it's not as like axiomatic and highly predictive of a variable as so many people seem to insist, but I think identity certainly matters. And then the one that I am so shocked by the extent to which I just find utterly lacking from almost any analysis, which is not reducible to it's not reducible to your socioeconomic status or your identity, is just the actual experiences that you've had, the extent to which you have been traumatized and psychologically disorganized by your interactions with people who are more powerful than you. And this is something, it just astonishes me that movements don't really seem to have any language for this. We can talk infinitely and indefinitely about all the nuances of oppression that somebody experiences based on race or gender or sexual orientation, but we really seem to just like hit this wall. There's just like this terra incognita, total blank spot, like completely unanalyzed terrain, when it's like, well, what's the difference between somebody who got fucked as a little kid and was scared of their parents and had to fight to survive, and somebody who didn't? Do we expect there to be a difference there? And in my observation, that's been a really profound predictor of where people are at politically. I find that people are a lot more willing to fight if they've been abused by somebody in some position of power. You know, and so I think that, again, liberals are going to tend to be people who aren't suffering on a daily basis from things that happened to them at some point in the past when somebody more powerful than them did something to them. And, you know, I think that it's also highly revealing. If these are like the 4 dimensions that ultimately create a liberal, and then we're operating from this premise that whatever they say in terms of their surface political arguments, it's ultimately a rationalization of a core disposition they have, of a need for security, of an unwillingness to engage in risk and confrontation, of a desire not to get tear gassed or beat up or killed or put in prison, of a sense that they have something to lose, of a sense of not wanting to lose the house that they own or whatever, of a lack of rage in their hearts that comes from just not having had anything really all that bad ever happen to them. You know, I think that one thing that we should expect to see is the arguments for their positions changing over time while their positions themselves remain constant, right? And this is just sort of like, this is always like a lens through which all human behavior should be evaluated. Like you find ethnocentric behaviors and perceptions everywhere in the world, and they all have these like really similar features. You know, you can hear white people rambling about how Mexicans are coming to take their jobs. You can hear Nazis rambling about how Jews control the banks. You can hear Chinese people talking about how Uyghurs need to be locked up because they present a threat to Chinese society. I have no idea what the Turks said before they committed the Armenian genocide, but they had some rationale or another, right? And so you can see all these instances where people say various things, you know, like the Hutus and the Tutsis had a different premise for their ethnic conflict than the Nazis and the Jews, but somehow or another it always results in extermination. Always these same kind of basic behaviors repetitively emerge. And I think that, you know, in the case of liberalism, we see exactly this. We see how the core sort of premise that we shouldn't engage in escalated confrontation with the power structure has remained constant, but the justifications for this have changed over time. First of all, specifically with violence and nonviolence. It was much, much more common a couple decades ago for people to present their aversion to escalated conflict as a moral priority. They claimed that they were simply morally opposed to violence itself. And you could always tell that there was something very deep and unexamined there, because it was a classic phenomenon, a very, very common phenomenon at major mobilizations for there to be a liberal who would physically attack somebody who wasn't even attacking the police, but was just like breaking a window or something out of this ostensible commitment to the premise of nonviolence. But you never, ever, ever saw those same people attack the police when they were brutalizing people out of this same conviction to nonviolence. But then as the years wearily marched along, the premise really shifted. And it no longer became the case that people were citing a moral objection to violence itself. They were claiming that violence was simply unstrategic. Again, we're all participating in this vast moral dialogue. In this vast moral dialogue, the police hurt us, we don't fight back, then they see our point, then society moves towards this grand consensus that we're all converging on as we race through history. And then it's also true that to some extent, the very same claims that get invoked in the violence and nonviolence discussion have also started to be somewhat supplanted by a really rigid, weaponized form of identity politics. But it has the exact same set of implications. In whether it's nonviolence explicitly or whether it's this version of identity politics, the same people are making the same basic argument that and the argument always is that it's wrong to throw rocks at the cops, right? The argument always is that it's wrong to escalate. So in the case of the violence-nonviolence thing, it's either the moral dilemma, or it's either the moral objection, or it's the strategic objection. And then in the case of identity politics, it's always, it's always the claim that there is a certain identity that should be establishing political leadership, that movements shouldn't exist as pluralistic, diverse phenomena where different people do different things, where everybody should be following the leadership of the people with the right identity. And then there's just kind of this magic trick that people do where they're like literally pretending that people of any given identity, black people, for instance, are like a monolithic entity that all share a political perspective and all have the same strategic initiatives in mind. And then it's finding a person who meets that identity criteria who doesn't want escalation and saying, this is the leader. This is a community leader or whatever, right? And we should listen to them, because otherwise what we're doing is racist. And so that process requires just literally pretending like for instance, black people who are burning down police stations and throwing Molotov cocktails at cop cars don't exist, or somehow aren't as legitimately black as the community leaders that are being referred to. So that's another really profound flaw, I think, with the violence versus nonviolence binary that we have endlessly, exhaustively debated for years in social movements, is that it tends to, at the outset, assume that there is a strategy, and that there's a correct strategy and then a whole landscape of incorrect strategies. And that people should be following the correct strategy. And if people are doing different things, it's assumed that these different things aren't going to be somehow complementary. It's assumed that they're deviations from the true path, and the more deviations they are, the more difficult it'll be for people on the true path to achieve their objectives, right? So the violence versus nonviolence framing has many different insidious aspects to it. It creates an in-group and an out-group that includes the power structure in the police as well as the protesters in the in-group. It assumes a strategically monolithic movement that only engages in one kind of resistance, and it totally rejects pluralism. And then I think that another thing that's really like psychologically impactful about it, that tends to make it a source of really intense argumentation and tends to make it something that creates intense conflict, is that it's framed as an actual choice. The premise itself is just as false as anything one could possibly encounter. So it's framed as this decision: do we want to live in a violent world or a non-violent world? And this is ridiculous. Like, do you want to live in a world where nobody hurts anybody? okay, sure, yeah, I'd like that. And since we're talking about things that I'd like that probably aren't going to happen, you know, I'd also like a magical pony to follow me around and whisper I love you in my ear all the time and tell me about how amazing I am, and I want it to give me free drugs anytime I ask for them, you know. But like, this isn't the world that we live in. We don't get the choice to decide not to live in a violent world. We live in a violent world. There was, I believe it was a Crime Think piece that came out right when the Minneapolis police station burned down, that was titled, "Now This Fight Has Two Sides." And I think that summarizes what happens when people start fighting back against the police, as well as anything. It's not that there's this massive shift and now there's violence in the world. There was already violence in the world. Let's remember these protests started because somebody died, perhaps passing a counterfeit 20. You know, the question is just whether the violence will be reciprocated. The question is whether people will simply be hurt or whether they will fight back against the people who are hurting them. So, you know, these are some of the reasons that the framing of violence versus nonviolence has mired movements in just years of agonizing, useless fucking debate.
But it wasn't until people started to try to lift me up and I saw there were pools of blood on the ground and people were saying she's been shot, she's been shot.
Not everybody wants to take the same chance. Nonviolent, and many people won't turn up unless they expect. Nonviolent.
It wasn't until people started to try to lift me up and I saw there were pools of blood on the ground and people were saying she's been shot, she's been shot.
He pleaded for his life. He said he couldn't breathe.
Having looked at all of the corollaries of political outlook, all of the psychological tendencies, all of the brain structure differences, all the differences in baseline physiology, in orientations to risk and novelty seeking, and how they correlate with political outlook, you know, that provides a really good basis for saying that political orientations are fundamentally not very rational. But it also simply articulates, it simply illustrates the really profound, innate differences that exist between people that that are manifest in our societies as political difference. And I think that that's as scientific a refutation of the premise of liberalism, the core premise of liberalism, as one could hope to encounter. Because again, over and over again, what liberals say every time that the glass starts shattering is that this violence threatens this great moral dialogue that we're having, and that as soon as we stop with the violence, there will be like a harmonious accord between all these parties in this conflict, and we will come to some kind of consensus because we ultimately fundamentally share a perceptual framework and a set of core values. And what the science of political difference tells us is that we don't. We don't actually share a perceptual framework, and we don't share core values. And it's very, very difficult to transcend self-referentiality. It's very hard when you're thinking about what humanity is. It's very hard to understand the extent to which you're actually just referring back to yourself. And so it's very difficult. And I say this referring to myself as well. Like, my political career has taken me through many surprises and taken me to a point where I had to come to terms with people being more different than I actually thought they were at the beginning of my experience of organizing. But people are really, really, really different. And that's what the science tells us. That's what scientific paper after scientific paper, based in statistical analysis, brain imaging, studies of genetics, all of these different facets, all of these different methods for studying the human species that converge on these results, that people have these profound innate differences. And therefore, we can't just assume out of hand that we're all going to reason with one another towards some kind of consensual form of society, that there's going to be some great consensus about how society should operate that we're all just going to eventually reach through rational dialogue. What the science of political difference tells us is that conflict may just be a really intrinsic feature of our species. And I want to temper this. It's always about the synthesis. So I do want to say it works both ways. I think that mapping out all the very distinct cognitive tribes that comprise humanity also actually does give us the best shot at understanding one another. I think that the more that we can transcend self-referentiality, the more we can think of ways to frame political discussions in ways that actually make sense to people with different political orientations. I think the more that we actually can figure out points of commonality between people, and that is what my politics are about. Like I very much practice the politics of building consensus. I have a radically pluralistic orientation to politics. So my question is never who has the great strategy and how do we critique all the other strategies? Who has the great vision for society and how should we critique all the other visions? My premise is always just to assume that people are different and that they're going to have different ultimate political objectives and different ideas about how to achieve those political objectives. And it's about finding where the points of agreement exist. And I think that we can build a society that's built on consensus to the greatest extent possible if we stop pretending like everybody is exactly like us and having arguments with people with really different perspectives where we're actually just presenting a position that would be convincing to us but not them, and we start actually speaking to people in the terms that they think in and the terms of the world as they understand it to exist. But I do think that that's like the happy part of what mapping out the innate differences between people that map to political difference will achieve. But I do also think that there's going to be times when we're just going to be presented with situations where that's not a possibility. And I think that's also what the science of innate difference tells us. And I think that's as powerfully scientific a refutation of liberalism and nonviolence as one could hope to articulate, really. Especially if we look at the evidence for the right-left political spectrum being correlated with variation in aggression, because then we should expect there to be like a sort of innate level of violence associated with some political perspectives. And as long as violence is being engaged in by some parties with some political perspectives, it's not really a viable strategy for other people with other political perspectives to eschew violence altogether. So those are some of the indications that liberalism is not a political position that's arrived at through a process of rational deliberation, but that it serves as a rationalization for core dispositions which are not articulated. But of course, like every political position, liberalism is presented as if it were science. Liberalism is presented as if people just meticulously surveyed all the evidence they could find and spent agonizing night after agonizing night relating all these complex variables until they came up with the perfect political strategy, and it was liberalism. And so it's worth looking at the extent to which liberalism and nonviolence has attempted to explicitly present itself as a scientific premise. And to that end, I'm deeply grateful for a book called Why Civil Resistance Works: The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan. And when I say that I'm deeply grateful for this work, I mean this in two regards. One is a very sarcastic, scathing regard, and one is a totally earnest sense of appreciation, because I do actually really think that resistance strategies should be evaluated in a more scientific fashion. I'm truly horrified by the extent to which there is just really not a serious science of resistance politics, and we entertain strategy after strategy, but we never really treat strategies as falsifiable hypotheses. We never We never engage in a political undertaking saying, well, there's a premise here that could be validated or could not be validated by what we're doing. We never really seem to develop very rich or rigorous methods for studying how to achieve a political end. And so in that sense, I actually really do appreciate this work, Why Civil Resistance Works, because it does at least contribute to this very sparse landscape of attempting to use somewhat scientific methods to study political interventions. You know, it's at least talking about resistance politics and using statistical tests and things like that. And so on that, in that regard, I think that anything that contributes to this literature is hugely useful and generates momentum for a kind of science that I would really like to see develop. And then, you know, the sarcastic, scathing regard in which I really appreciate this work is that it doesn't make any sense or say anything that's true, and it can be really helpful. The liberal nonviolence dialogue, like so many sort of like core political positions that people take, is, you know, they are very often not really very explicitly articulated. They just kind of consist of a very diffuse set of perspectives that are offered and points that are made, but there's never really like a cohesive theoretical framework where they're all like kind of brought in together, and there's never really like a rigorous statement of what the actual premise is. And so that actually makes it really hard to argue. As many violence versus nonviolence discussions as I've witnessed and participated in, it's always been really hard to argue with people about it because so much of what they're saying isn't really being said, right? And so this book takes the premise of nonviolence and makes like a very explicit case for it. And so that's really useful because it gives you something substantive to point out the glaring flaws and hideous inaccuracies in. And so I'm also really appreciative of this work in that respect. So Why Civil Resistance Works was published in 2011 initially, and so it kind of falls into the time frame when nonviolence was no longer really being presented as purely a moral imperative, but more as a strategic one. And so it definitely is in that vein. And it builds on existing theory. It builds on the theories of people like Gene Sharp and others. But what it does differently than any previous work in the nonviolence canon is that it actually assesses a bunch of different campaigns and does statistical analysis that ostensibly proves that nonviolence is more strategically effective than violence. And so, like on the very first page of the book, there's a description of the East Timorese resistance to Indonesian occupation that sort of like characterizes the core premise that they're invoking of how nonviolence works, like what the liberal nonviolence strategy is. So the Indonesian regime repressed this movement following its standard approach to violent and nonviolent challengers from within. But this repression backfired. Following the deaths of more than 200 East Timorese nonviolent protesters at the hands of Indonesian troops in Dili in November 1991, the pro-independence campaign experienced a major turning point. The massacre, which was captured on film by a British cameraman, was quickly broadcast around the world, causing international outrage and prompting the East Timorese to rethink their strategy. And then skipping ahead a little bit, on September 14th, 2000, the UN Security Council voted unanimously to authorize an Australian-led international force for East Timor. So that's the basic premise of nonviolence, right? Is to go out in the streets and suffer, go out in the streets and get beaten, go out in the streets and get shot, and just let them do it to you. and then hope that images of your suffering and your death get broadcast around the world, and hope that it provokes outrage, and hope that somebody with some other kind of power, somebody other than the person who is ordering the killing and the beating, it intervenes in some fashion. And so, like, the first critiques that can be leveled at this premise, I think, are moral and psychological. So, like, one is just wrapped up in the psychology of abuse. We can see clearly how this recapitulates at the scale of an entire society the premise that people in abusive relationships maintain in staying in those relationships. So, like, if we heard an individual say about their husband or whoever, yeah, he did something monstrous, but it's not because he's ultimately a bad person. He is actually really innately good deep down inside, and he was driven to this monstrous behavior by a lack of deference or acquiescence or understanding, or some external contingency that was novel and ephemeral. But if I treat this person who hurt me with even greater deference and even greater acquiescence than I've already shown in letting them hurt me the first time around, then they'll see how what they're doing is wrong, and we will progress towards a harmonious accord where this kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. And if somebody says that about an individual, we say, oh, that's the psychology of abuse. That's somebody justifying an abusive relationship that they're in. But if somebody says this about society at large, we put them on CNN and we call them a voice of reason, right? And then there's also just like I think that there's a core moral objection that one can make to this being a political strategy, which is just that this premise is not non-violent at all. This is just this political strategy doesn't involve no one using violence. It's a strategy of allowing violence to be concentrated in the hands of people who already have the greatest capacity for violence. It doesn't say let's live in a non-violent world. It says let the adults handle it. Let the adults commit acts of violence. And so, like, when your strategy explicitly involves a UN army coming to fight the other people who were hurting you, your strategy is not nonviolent. You're just not taking personal responsibility for the violence. And, I think that I don't know what to say about that exactly, except that I think that it's wrong. And I also think it doesn't make any goddamn sense or mean anything if you can't think of somebody who has more power and more guns who's going to come intervene on your behalf. What does it mean to invoke this strategy in the United States of America? Should we expect that if we let the police beat us up enough in the streets that the UN is going to send a peacekeeping force? Because I really fucking doubt it. But then the next objections that can be made are kind of more methodological. So they do this statistical analysis. They analyze a couple hundred instances of resistance campaigns, I think pretty much all of which were against like an actual regime. Like the target of most of them was regime change per se. And then how they do the analysis is that they simply divide campaigns into violent or non-violent categories, and then they describe them as either successful or unsuccessful. And so the authors themselves describe the very profound difficulty with this analytical procedure when they say, quote, "The separation of campaigns into violent and non-violent for analytical purposes is problematic. Few campaigns historically have been purely violent or non-violent, and many resistance movements, particularly protracted ones, have had violent and non-violent periods. Armed and unarmed elements often operate simultaneously in the same struggle." So right there, and then later on, they likewise say that these categorical classifications of successful or unsuccessful are also awfully murky when you get right down to it. And so right there you have as clear and convincing an articulation as one could hope for of why this analytical procedure just doesn't really mean anything or make any sense. They're going to take a bunch of resistance campaigns that have had an incredible array of tactics, both violent and nonviolent, employed throughout them, and then they're just going to arbitrarily classify some as nonviolent and some of them as violent. And likewise, in so many cases, success is a really murky category, but they're just going to arbitrarily classify some resistance campaigns as successful and some as unsuccessful. And so then if you look at how these campaigns are actually coded, you get into like this is where the work just descends into utter chaos, right? So for instance, the Soviet resistance to the Nazi occupation is described as a violent failure. And I just really can't imagine the criterion by which one concludes that the Soviet resistance to the Nazi occupation was not a success. I would imagine that the premise is that the actual that they're analyzing like the underground resistance campaign, the partisan campaign that existed in concert with the regular armed forces campaign against the Nazis. And they're kind of saying like, oh, no. Well, it was the regular armed forces that actually defeated the Nazis. So this insurgent campaign was a violent failure. But, here again, going back to the East Timorese example, like somehow or another, some military conquest seems to be the premise of all these nonviolent successes. So I just don't understand why getting killed on worldwide television and then an army coming in to defend you is a nonviolent success, but fighting alongside a military that ultimately wins is a violent failure. And so like that just really illustrates the nature of the analytical procedure they used, which was to send all these different instances of social struggle to various people in academic departments who are involved in nonviolence studies. And that's to say that they're nonviolence ideologues. And then they had these nonviolence ideologues classify all of these struggles. So what their statistical research really shows is that people who are ideologically committed to nonviolence will tend to arbitrarily classify struggles as either violent or nonviolent, and will tend to describe the ones that they arbitrarily classify as nonviolent as a victory more often than as a failure. And I don't really know if that's equivalent to saying that the research has discovered much at all. And just to give an illustration of how utterly meaningless this binary classification of struggles into violent and nonviolent categories really does become, the 1978 through 1979 revolution in Iran against the Shah that brought the Ayatollah Khomeini to power is classified as a non-violent victory. So here's a passage from this book, From Why Civil Resistance Works, with a few highlights from this non-violent campaign. On February 10th, soldiers from the Imperial Guard returned to the air base, but were unable to subdue insurgents, who were surrounded by masses of civilians. At this point, leftist guerrillas assumed a prominent role in supporting the mutiny at the Tehran Air Force Base. Opposition violence intensified after weapons taken from armories and fallen soldiers were given to young men. Crowds of Iranians formed barriers around the tanks. In a few tanks, targets of Molotov cocktails caught fire. Around the country, crowds of people surrounded garrisons and prevented military reinforcements from reaching Tehran. Imperial Guard tanks made their way through hostile and now highly armed crowds. fighting with insurgents and killing hundreds of protesters in the final 2 days. So that's the kind of complexity that you have to pretend doesn't exist if you want to classify social struggles as either violent or nonviolent. You often hear people critique reductionism, and it's very frequently a proxy for critiquing science itself. A lot of people use the term as kind of a dirty word who don't really seem to know what it actually means very well. Like if you want to understand an organism, it's good to understand that it's comprised of cells, and it's good to understand that those cells are comprised of molecules, and the molecules are comprised of atoms, and that's reductionism, right? Like that's what reductionism does, and it's not always bad. But of course there are properties that organisms have that you can't predict by looking at molecules or atoms or cells. And so, reductionism is a limited framework. It's only one way of looking at the world, and you have to also be able to assess things in terms of the emergent properties they possess, or you will be led into falsehood. So, there's legitimate critiques to be made of reductionism in certain contexts, but it doesn't intrinsically mean something bad. But you can imagine all of these people who would encounter any science they don't like and just be like, oh, well, that's reductionist, without really giving a lot of thought to what that means. Who would take this research and think it's great. Who would take Chenoweth and Stefan's work and be like, isn't that amazing? They did statistical analysis. They used math to show that violence is bad and nonviolence is the only thing that really works. But, this is a case where reductionism has gone horribly awry, where people chose to reduce a very, very complex landscape to a few extremely simple categorical variables, and any meaning that could have been derived from the analysis got lost in the process. And what's amazing about this is that liberals loved this book. I have definitely been in conversations with liberal political organizers who cited this work as a justification for trying to repress political activity that they viewed as too destructive or hostile or confrontational or whatever, because they'd be like, well, but Chenoweth and Stefan have shown us that nonviolence is more successful than violence. And that's amazing. It's amazing to take a work that looks at all these social struggles where people were throwing Molotov cocktails and commandeering armories and burning tanks, and say like, oh, well, they decided to pretend like it was simpler than it actually was, and that was a nonviolent struggle, and it worked, and they showed that nonviolence is the way. So now we can use that as a justification for saying that nobody should ever throw a Molotov cocktail or commandeer an armory or burn a tank, right? It's wild. And this, again, is just like a really powerful indication that liberalism doesn't come from a rational analysis of strategic context. Liberalism is a core, unarticulated disposition that finds a political premise as a rationale. So that's kind of the next objection that one could make to this work is methodological, is just that the level of reductionism renders the entire thing utterly incoherent. And then the final objection that can be made to this whole premise, to the core premise of this work, even if you're fine with the notion, because as much as it might feel morally and psychologically repulsive to let people hurt you in order to have your suffering televised and have some other external entity come in to intervene on your behalf, if it actually worked better, if you're going to go into a revolutionary situation, you're going to risk a lot of death and suffering one way or the other. So, if it actually worked better, maybe it would still be worthwhile. But I think that there's this real divergence between what's possible in that scenario and what we actually want. So there's this assumption that no matter what it is, no matter what the harm is that you're objecting to, no matter what you're fighting for, there's supposedly always some group of socioeconomic elites around. There's always some cadre of military generals and, you know, like business leaders and religious leaders and prominent media figures or whatever, who, if you get beat up by the cops with sufficient equanimity and dignity and, you know, nonviolent restraint, will see the beauty and meaning of your political perspective, and then they will intervene on your behalf. And that might be true in terms of the UN's relationship to Indonesia occupying East Timor, but like, what does that mean if what you're fighting is the trajectory of industrial civilization to ending life on Earth? What does that mean if you live in the United States and you're fighting police brutality? Wait, like, we cannot, like, do we really think that there's a cadre of socioeconomic elites who are just kind of like, who have all of our same perspectives, but they're just kind of latent and they're just waiting for us to suffer enough in the streets to be sort of activated, to have their consciences stirred and to come rushing to our aid? I mean, there's just not. There is no cadre. I've spent years navigating the absurdist theater that is climate policy, and there is definitely no cadre of generals or prominent media figures or whoever that wants what's actually necessary to avert ecological collapse. There's just not. They're all perfectly familiar with the situation, and they've all chosen to stay on the trajectory we're on. It doesn't matter how nobly or beautifully I get beat up by the cops. They are never coming to my aid. And so that's kind of like really the true and fundamental critique of this work in particular, but also kind of all the nonviolence theory it's based on, the pillars of support theory, Gene Sharp's work, all that stuff, is that it just all assumes that there's some paternalistic, benevolent power structure out there that will come to your aid if you engage in politics with a sufficient willingness to be injured without fighting back. And it's just not true.
He pleaded for his life. He said he couldn't breathe.
We'll talk again soon. If you're out there listening and you haven't participated in any of these protests, I'm telling you, don't be like me. Get out in the streets. These things only happen every once in a while, and if you don't participate, it can be very easy to imagine that you'll simply participate in something analogous that'll happen at some hypothetical point in the future. But these moments, these opportunities only come along so often, and when they do, if you participate in them, it will radically shift your sense of yourself, your sense of what's humanly possible, and your whole orientation towards life. And so don't, you know, we could go through years more of stifling dystopia with no real meaningful countervailing forces in sight. And you don't want to deal with that without having experienced what it felt like to be in the streets with everybody right now. Because I'm watching it on the fucking internet, taking pain pills, and it is very clearly amazing. So find a way to participate. Find a bail fund to give money to if you have money. Develop a strategy, develop a platform for people to pursue. Bring whatever kind of aid you can to the front lines. Do whatever you can, but find a way to participate in, because this shit will be in history books. All right, love to y'all, and we will talk again soon.